Okay, so moving right along here. Yeah, our next presenter is probably one of the coolest cats you're ever going to meet. He's extraordinarily mellow. Those of you that have had an opportunity to interact with him, Mr. Josh Kullis, he is a cool cat. He actually owns a cat. Apparently he adopted a feral cat. He was named Walter, who's apparently a madman. The thing is like this big, 15 pounds. You want to be careful when you go up to pet him. I've not met Walter yet, but I'm looking forward to the day sometime soon. If you don't find him at the office, you'll probably find him hanging out at Mod Pizza or sipping a craft brew or up at the Palace. He is a frequent concert goer. So he's going to talk about walking the walk, right? Because Auros, you've heard all about these great ideas over the last few days, but man, if we're really worth our weight, then there's probably a bunch of stuff that we're doing ourselves in Auros, right? Well, we are. So and Josh is here to tell you all about that. So please help me in welcoming Mr. Josh Kullis.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? All right, so while we're getting this set up, I'll give you guys a little bit of an intro. Thank you, Jeff, I think, for that introduction. Like Jeff said, though, what we wanted to do today was kind of talk a little bit about how we use Auros and how we use it to kind of run some of our processes internally. So when I first started with the company was a little bit smaller than it is now. And we had a couple subject matter experts, and they were doing a lot of the project management, and they were running a lot of the programs that we were running with our customers, implementing the software and so on and so forth. So we were doing a really good job with that small group of people. We were making sure that our projects were successful, our customers liked the service that we were giving, and our company was successful in general. So once the team started to grow and we started to benefit from some of that success, we started to see some of the things that we talk about when we talk about implementing the knowledge-aware technique. So those things are recurring mistakes, or maybe learning something and it doesn't get put back into your process. As we started to expand and we started to bring more junior level application engineers on board, they were making mistakes that our more senior application engineers had not made or had already made in the past and learned from. So what we started to do is think about, what if there was a system that we could use that would help us prevent those recurring mistakes? And come to find out, we actually sell one. So we started, kind of the younger application engineers, started to think about how we could use that to help implement the software. So we wanted to pick the brains of these guys that were experienced so that we didn't have to go through the pain of learning the lessons that they learned. So we started to do that with something that we call our seed project process. Our seed project process is what we'll use when we implement the software to customer site. So we come into the customer site, we try to learn as much as we can about the processes and the things that they have in place, the documentation that they have in place. And then we want to be able to configure the system initially so that we can then transfer our knowledge to them so that they can end up holding and running the processes within Auros and allowing those processes to become knowledge aware as well. So a little bit, I'll give a rundown kind of where we'll go with the presentation today, and then we'll jump into each one of the individual processes and how we use Auros to accomplish these different things. So in addition to our seed project process, we also do strategic planning within the software. So Jeff Moffa is actually going to help me when we get to that point in the process. He's going to help with that presentation. In addition to strategic planning, we also run our software factory in the tool. So that has to do with both the content management, so what changes we put into the software every time it gets released, as well as the actual management of the release itself. So when do we do things? How do we do things? How do we get them accomplished? We want to track different metrics that are associated with those things, and we do that through Auros. In addition to that, we have some other uses that we'll touch on briefly. And then we will talk about some future applications, some of the areas that we want to start using the software in. When we first started doing this in seed projects, we didn't really understand, or I guess we didn't really realize how many different applications we could use it on. So we'll talk a little bit at the end of this presentation about the other uses that we have for the software that are outside of the seed project, strategic planning in the software factory, and then some future applications where we think we can use it as well. So for the seed project process, I talked a little bit about how we do this, how we go out, we learn as much as we can about customer information. We then try to configure the system and then teach them how to use Auros to help make it so that their processes are knowledge aware. So what we're looking at here is a method K-Pack that we've used to design the process and define what steps should happen when. And then you can see there's a little icon in the bottom left-hand corner of all these different boxes. And that represents a collection of things, best practices, guidelines, whatever you want to call them, that need to be completed in order for that step in the process to be complete. So when we first started with this, I went to Jeff and I went to Steve Boiser, and they were the senior members of our team. And I said, how do you guys do projects? What do you do first? And they were like, well, every project is kind of different. So there really isn't standard work that we do in order to implement a project. And I said, well, at least I'm hoping that you guys don't just go into the room and like wing it, right? And they don't. But what ended up coming out of these discussions is something that we see a lot of the time with knowledge-aware techniques and with subject matter experts. Because they're so familiar with what they do, they take a lot of things for granted. As the younger or the more greener engineers on the team, we didn't take those things for granted because we didn't know them. So what we actually did is we defined the process, we came up with these high-level steps, and then as we went through that process, we started to take these things that they were taking for granted because they knew all of them and it just came natural to them, and we started to put them in the proper boxes. So what we have now, and the way we implement the software now across our customer base, is we have the high-level process defined, and then when you get to each step in the process, there's a collection of items that needs to be done. So I'll show a little bit of how this works live. So Jeremy, if you can go to the demo for me. Oh yeah, I guess I need to plug it in, huh? Is your port this side? I got it. Oh, I think I've got it. So when we get this plugged in, we'll switch over to the demo and we'll show you guys a little bit about how this works. Okay, so what we're looking at here is I've simulated an assessment control. So we have the first phase of our process defined. We have 4 different phases in our seed project process. The first one is planning and knowledge sharing. We then go through the representation that we saw in the presentation, which is a step we call data decomposition and system configuration. The meat of our projects are all in that particular phase. So what we do there is we implement the first go of how we think the software will work. Then we go through iterations of simulating that process so that we can understand if there are things that we missed, if there may be things that are in there that don't make sense that we thought would make sense in the beginning. But we go through this iterative process that allows us to then refine the way the software works so that end users, once it gets rolled out, don't find those imperfections. The next step in our process is what we call a pilot and system adjustment. So once the team has kind of worked on this and they've got a refined process that we think is good to show to people, we'll bring someone in that hasn't been involved in the project. We then have them try it out and run the actual work that they would normally do through the software and give us feedback on what works well, what doesn't work well, maybe additional things that could be incorporated that aren't incorporated now. So we just finished this with Matt Barron's team, actually, and we find that there are a lot of things, like I said, that we started to take for granted as we were configuring the software. We get fresh eyes on it. Those people don't take those things for granted, so they're able to help us refine the process before we roll it out to everyone in an organization. And then finally, as closing for the project, we do something that we call feedback, evaluation, and production planning. And what that is we want to review the goals that we set for the project at the beginning. Did we accomplish those goals? And is there anything that we need to do before we actually close the project out? So I'm going to go to this last phase. So as you can see here, again, this is just all simulated information. There's a collection of information that needs to be evaluated here at this seed review and support planning step. So we have an assessment control where we've defined the criteria for what makes a seed project successful. Without going into all the details of that information, that's an assessment. It's delivered directly into the process. So when our application engineers are running their seed projects, they're using this assessment control as the place they do their work. So we're not keeping notes in emails. We're not doing tasks in other systems and then uploading anything here. With us, it's not quite as complicated because we're not making CAD parts and things like that, so we don't need that feature. We actually use this module as the place where we do our work. So we run our meetings. Any of you that have done seed projects with us, you'll see us run the meetings directly off the assessment control. So it's a really good way for us to manage, to track, and to make sure that we're not losing anything from a historical standpoint. So on this particular assessment control, we're evaluating the health of the project itself. And there's a number of different categories that we measure things on. This one's, again, just simulated. Was the timing met? Was the scope achieved? And things like that. But this allows us to then run metrics across all of our seed projects to see how healthy all those projects are and what areas we need to improve in. So with that, I think we'll go back to the presentation. Jeremy, if you can. So like I said, this is a representation of the second phase of our project. Once we get done with a seed project, we rate that project based on those health characteristics, and then we're able to run metrics across those characteristics. This is the point where I'm going to hand off to Jeff because those characteristics actually take part in our strategic planning process.
Thank you, Josh. Okay, I think we now want to go to the live demo. We need to. Sorry. Alrighty, so as Josh mentioned, we use our own tool to manage the knowledge and collection and learnings of how we do our business, including the seed project process. We're also using it to collect data about the health of those processes. And the cool thing that we get to do now is roll that up into higher level views of the data and performance of the company. So at the very highest end of this process, we have the overall company objectives. I'm going to reveal to you what our objectives are for the Auros company because this is the actual assessment that we have. So this isn't the one that is current for us, but it is the actual criteria that we're using, right? So we have 4 basic criteria that we're really managing on, that we're trying to manage at the highest level of the company that are strategic importance to us. One of them is seed project health, another is existing customer health, and then there's a couple other business performance ones. And these are all algorithmic driven, but we need to collect a lot of data. But with our own system and with the way we're doing it, it becomes quite straightforward to keep this up to date and visualized. So I'm going to take, Josh showed you how we're managing and evaluating at the end of the seed project, the health of a seed project using an Auros assessment to do that. But now with some of the newer features of assessments, what I can do in the highest level dashboard of our strategic objectives is to pull up this new feature that I'm going to talk about a little bit later and show, if I just take the data range here a little bit back further. And this is the same as the one Josh showed you that he was simulating where we score an 8. And what it's doing is it's showing me for all the assessments out there for seed project health, including this is just simulated data that we have here, I can visualize that data from all the different projects on this report over time without anybody doing anything. It just happens as part of the process. The data's there. It rolls up to me in this report, and it's giving me the statistical analysis on the data as well, and that's all free of charge as well. So I can see that the average value, in the simulated data for our health of our seed projects is a 7.5 out of 10. And again, we've driven this algorithmically. So then we can then understand from a dashboard standpoint, where we are. We can transfer that value. Okay, if we have a 7.5 value for the quarter, we drive that into an assessment, and this was simulated data, but you get the point. So we can drive the values from these health evaluations by the teams, the different teams, drive them up to a single value, which then evaluates a health characteristic of the overall company. It's a very good way to use the knowledge-aware process to keep the knowledge in the flow of work, continue the learning process, and bubble it all the way up to this highest level strategic characteristic. Okay, that's all I got for the strategic planning process. Back to Josh.
Here, if you go to the presentation again. So before we move on to the software factory stuff, does anyone have any questions about what we just went over? How we use the software to kind of run our implementations? It allows us to make sure that our application engineers are consistently running the same process and not making the mistakes that we've made in the past. Does anyone have any questions before we move on to the software factory stuff?
Yeah. So I guess not a question, just a comment, I guess. So the Borg Warner team went through this seed project with Josh and Jimmy, and we had a very large program. We have with 32 global program managers we were trying to get feedback from. The seed project was very smooth. The process went very well. We started in March. We're trying to roll out right now, and I think we're at a point where we can actively do it. So I'd say the seed project was very successful, and it was very helpful having them on site and knowing what were the next steps. So it also taught us some things about our own process. So I definitely recommend or see the value in the seed project.
Thank you.
I just have a simple question. All right, so you have that number that you get in that high-level report. What if you don't like that number?
We have a mic.
So I completely understand where you're coming from that question. So we could have designed the process to automatically accept that number. That number is only for me because it's not only for me, it's for the entire company. But that, there's not an agency issue, meaning I, as responsible for the performance of the company, am not going to change that number in a way that is not realistic, right? So I see that statistical number, and I'm transferring it directly, and I could automate that process, but right now we're doing it on a quarterly. We kind of just started.
No, I get that part
Okay.
of it, but what I'm saying is you leading the organization, if your team, you're striving to get a higher number or a better performance, I mean, where do you get the information to find out, hey, I don't like this number, I want to improve this number, where do I go in my processes? What do I fix first?
Josh?
Yeah, that basically comes back to all the processes and activities that we track in the system. So that number is an aggregate of all those underlying processes. So if we have that overall number that we don't like, and we want to start understanding where we need to, put resources in order to make that number come up, all the metrics that we have underneath it, so how the seed projects are performing, how ongoing customer support projects are performing, all those kinds of things bubble up into that number, and we can drill down into the components of it through the system. So as a product of the engineers and the team using Auros to do their job, all those reports and all that information is stored historically, and we can go back and mine that data if we want to.
So he didn't get into the detail, but the health evaluation of a seed project is surprisingly non-subjective. So the quantity of milestones met and the different metrics that go into that one number, which then composites over all seed projects into another number, so we're kind of keep going up, is surprisingly not subjective. It's very objective. And it'd be very difficult to mess with those numbers because they're specific measurements of the process.
Sorry, yeah, I wasn't implying
Yeah.
that to mess with the numbers.
No, I
I was
know.
implying exactly
Yeah.
what he said. How do I improve?
Yeah. Yeah, and as we continue, when we get to the later part of the presentation, as we continue to get more processes into the system and we start tracking and understanding where we perform on those levels as well, we can adapt the system and we can adapt those health characteristics to also include that information. So one of the things about Auros, and I'm going to turn into a little bit of a sales guy right here, the adaptability of the system and the ability for you to actually have the system configure and then move with your business process based on the changing needs is one of the big benefits of the software. And we're taking advantage of that as we continue to learn things about our business and incorporate new metrics and new processes into the software. Anything else before we jump into the software factory stuff? Okay. So the software factory, again, you're going to see a lot of things that look very similar because what we're doing is we're trying to control our process. We do things that are very technical. We do software coding. We develop code. But we're not producing automobiles. We're not producing parts for automobiles. So we're not doing CAD drawings. We're not doing things like that. So we really want to control the processes around what we're doing. And this is how we do it. We do it with these Auros methods. So when we get into our software factory, there's two different components of that factory. The first one is the actual changes that are being made. So how do we manage those changes and how do we make sure that those changes are made properly and that we test them and then they get released on time? So the first thing that we do is every time we have a change that's going to be made in the software, we raise an Auros issue. We have a bunch of different issue types within the software depending on how that change is managed. That issue is then going to be the life cycle of the change. So we're going to specify how that change is made. There's a lot of different metadata that goes around the changes being made. What features is it affecting? Do we need to write a new regression test? All those kinds of things can come out of the life cycle of one software change. So when we go through making changes, we solicit them from a number of different areas. We have our own internal strategic enhancements that we do. We have strategic partner enhancements that we do, so things that our customers request from us. We also have value-based enhancements. So we'll have suggestions that people make throughout the course of a release, and based on the value that those particular enhancements or those changes could provide, we'll add those as well. And then, unfortunately, the fourth bin that we have is defects. We would love it if we didn't have defects in the software, but inevitably we do. So we try to reduce those by controlling the actual process, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But this is basically the 4 different bins of how those changes get into the software. So before we started doing seed projects, we used our issues management to manage the content of the software release itself. So Jeremy, if you can go over to the presentation one more time. So when we manage our release process, we have a team board for the release. So our release cycle is every 6 months. We release the software every 6 months. We have a release actually coming up in 17 days on the 12th of October. That's the 8.1 release. And then our release process is a 9-month process. So we have each release will overlap by 3 months. So right now we have a tracking board for both the 8.1 release that comes out here in 17 days, and we have one for the 8.2 release that'll come out in April of next year. So when we open this up to talk about the actual content of the release itself, this is going to be a Kanban board on our team boards that allows us to see all the different software changes that are being made. So if something was an enhancement or a defect or something that we found before it got to the customer, all these things are here, and we can filter them by status. So if I only want to see the ones that are open, that we currently don't need to work on anymore, or that we do need to work on anymore, I can do that, so it's automatically paring these numbers down. So if I want to see the ones that the development team still needs to do work on, and it's not just a clerical issue that the application engineering team needs to take care of, I can turn other statuses off, and it'll show me that from a development standpoint, we have a lot of different things that are very close to being complete, which is good because we're releasing the software again in 17 days, right? So here we can see individual items that are being changed, and if we need to drill down into the details of those items, we can do that by clicking on these boards, and it'll pull up the entire life cycle of the change that was made. So on top of that, we've been doing that for a very long time. Now, as far as the process is concerned, we started using methods to control that. So when do we need to start planning? What are the different buckets where we get software changes from? And how do we make sure that we get those things in the software in a timely manner so that we can actually reduce the amount of time that it takes for us to release the software? So when we initially started, we had a small customer base, and we were releasing the software 4 times a year. As the customer base started to grow, that time started going from 3 months to 4 months to 5 months because we were putting additional software changes into the software to where the last couple of releases, they were a little bit over 12 months. So we got to a release cycle that was longer than we'd prefer it be. So we started to use these methods so that we can shrink that release cycle from the 12 or 13 months that it was down to 9. We can overlap them by 3, and then we can consistently release the software every 6 months. So these processes and these process controls have allowed us to do that. So the first thing that we see is the planning phase. So we want to know what are these changes that we're going to make. The next 2 that we go into are going to be really development cycles. So as we go through the development cycles, we want to make sure that our developers are getting a certain number of code changes complete in a timely manner. So these triangles that you'll see are a set of metrics that let us know whether or not we're adhering to those certain levels that we want people to adhere to. So when we open this up, we're going to see that there's a red metric on here for documentation. And I'm a little bit ashamed to say that that is my team's responsibility. So we were able to see that documentation was one of the things that was holding us up from releasing things. So we recently, within the last 2 months, we've hired a documentation specialist. She's actually here today. And we're able to see what's causing us to have lags in the release, and then we're able to address those things based on the metrics that the system's providing us. So in this third phase, again, is just going to be one of those thresholds become higher. So instead of 80% complete, we want to be up at 90, 95% complete. And again, the documentation is keeping us from hitting this mark. So we're not going to hold the release process up, but we are going to do things to address making sure that that documentation gets complete. One of the other things that we're able to do through Auros is have this process and then integrate things from multiple different communities of practice into the process. So once this loads up, there's a lot of different stuff on this screen, so it'll load up here in a second. But we also do our regression testing. So we have a set of 414 regression tests that our QA team will run through in 3 different browsers every time we release the software. We run that through multiple different sweeps, so it takes them about a week and a half or 2 weeks to get that particular sweep done. And you can see here that we do it in 2 different places formally. So we have them constantly doing regression testing, but on a formal basis, we do it twice. We do it once before we branch the code. Branching the code is when we just isolate it so that we can test it without making any changes. We do it once before that. We then branch the code, and then we test it on an isolated code base to make sure that the regressions that we're fixing are not causing other problems. And then finally, we release the software. So you can see that we have a documentation issue here, which means this red date hasn't been met. Again, we didn't hold our process up because of that. And we're actually on the branching event right now. So this is a live version or a live representation of where our release is. And at any point in time, if anyone on our team wants to see what this is, if customers want to know when the software is coming out or how the release is going, everyone has access to this from a global perspective. So we don't have to communicate that through email. We don't have to communicate it through word of mouth. It's all communicated right here through the process where the work is actually being done. So we've seen a lot of great benefits from this. And like I said, we're going to release our software in 17 days. Okay, so does anyone have any questions about this one before we go into some of the other uses? So Shane, there's one here. We've got another one here too. Right here.
Hey, so what version of the software are you using to develop the software? And are you worried that you might have a bit of a circular firing squad problem if you're using unreleased software?
So yes, we are using unreleased software to run our process. And there's some pros and some cons to that. So the pros are that we get to use real life workflows in the software. So the functionality and the usability of the software that hasn't been released to our customers, we can validate it through the fact that we're using it ourselves. So as the application engineering team and the development team is using the software, if there are things that don't make sense from an end user perspective, we're able to catch those things earlier on. The downside, however, is what you talked about. Sometimes we do get regressions. So we'll have regressions that get introduced into the software, and we just kind of, right now, because our team is as small as it is, it's not very difficult for us to manage that. As we start to grow and we get bigger, it's something that we will have to take into account. Go ahead.
Are any of these processes that you have on the board currently, are any of those driven by algorithms, or are they all human things?
Yeah. So I guess when you say algorithms,
So in other words, you're running through a validation system or something to that, where I don't have to have a person.
so to a certain degree. So all of the work that we do, when we do software development, it's run through the software. So based on the work being done in the software, we then run algorithms and we run metrics that are automatically reported. So where someone would manually have to come in and put all these numbers together for us, because those activities are being tracked and managed in Auros, we don't have to do that manual work. And then we do have some automated testing that happens as well. I don't think that's where the algorithm question was going.
Yeah,
but
that's exactly what I was doing. We
Oh,
have
right
a
on.
lot of automated testing where
Yeah.
what we do.
yeah, so we have
that's-
automated testing and it gets reported manually.
And in a few screens before this, you had a very attractive looking kind of GUI. It was visual by that thing. Now, can you actually take that data and actually extract it to the lowest level so you can roll it up yourself externally?
Yeah, so we can take this and we can drill down into the individual changes. So we can open this up and the actual life cycle of the change is all here. So all the communication is handled through the software. All the specification that was involved in this particular change is here. Okay. And then all of these individual items on this board are actually being counted systematically to provide us with all these numbers. Can you show a trend chart on that? Yeah. So this particular number right here is how many enhancements we have and how many of them need to be completed for this release. So when we open this up, we can see that over the course of time, we had a number of different enhancement requests that were coming in. And this is all just a product of the work being done in Auros. So the code development obviously isn't being done in Auros, but the actual tracking of the work is being done. Can you bring the mic up here? Or someone who has a second mic? Yeah.
For the software guys, that's just a classic burn down, and that burn down is completely automated based on the contents of the Kanban board that you saw. And I think that's what you're asking.
If you can go
Go
back
ahead.
to your flow chart,
Yeah.
Josh, please. Okay, so I played around a little bit with the flow chart. It's the first time I see the triangle. So is that a parameter sheet, or how do you?
So
what's behind that?
Yeah, the method canvas actually just gives you an option for a number of different shapes. We internally use certain shapes to signify certain things. So the triangles, we use them as the metric threshold. So those right now are representing, we want to make sure that we have 80% code complete at this point in time. If we're over that threshold, then we're good to move on to the next step. But the triangle is just a representation that we use.
The color coding and all that, because I assumed that because you didn't have your metric, you turned red. So did you use a parameter sheet to get that?
Yeah,
Okay,
so we
that's
have all the work that's being done. So all those numbers that we just saw in the report where that trend chart's being produced, they also can contribute to these reported parameters. So those counts come in, they get reported to the system, the thresholds are built against those counts, and then based on the comparison between the actual count and the threshold, it turns red or green automatically.
It's like a snapshot in times. In other words, that sheet is
It's
gonna
all
be-
real time.
It's updating, but you don't want it to continue updating because you want to keep on record that you were red. I'm just trying to see, because if you keep getting better and better, it's going
Right.
to change colors, and
Yes.
that's not what you want. You want to know that you were red there.
Right, so the way that we actually manage it, once we pass a certain triangle, we don't we don't need to track what it was before. So we track the counts, and we want to know how many like defects we had reported, how many enhancements were reported. But at a certain point in time, we have
Snapshot.
timing where we want to make that decision. Once we make the decision, at this point in time, we manage it all through the same number of thresholds, and that reference at the top will tell you, which actual process we're in, which phase we're in, and then based on this selection, it changes those thresholds. So we could do it where we had a snapshot every time, and it would be a certain number. We just don't do it that way, but you could. Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, there's one in the back.
So this rule processing engine that you're showing here, is this like an assessment control, or is this a different type of thing?
So the rule processing engine is going to be dynamically created based on the value tables that are configured in the KPAC. So Steve talked a little bit yesterday about being able to create a functional model in the knowledge packet. That functional model, instead of asking the engineer to interpret the requirement or interpret the specification, then understand how it applies to their program, then figure out whether they're passing or not and tell us whether they're passing, we're going to increase the fidelity of the information by asking them for the values that are associated with that threshold. Once those values are reported, and they can be reported from CAD, they can be reported from our system, a number of different systems, then the rule processing again just processes the rule.
And it's one KPAC per rule processing engine, or could the value tables come from multiple, or?
Yeah, you can do it either way. So you could have one rule per KPAC. This actually comes from a number of different KPACs, and they all aggregate together.
All right, thanks.
Yeah, got one back here.
The process that you show on the flowchart seems quite complex and very detailed. How do you account for flexibility? Let's say that you need to rerun one step,
Right.
or that for some reason that particular project does not require some steps. So
Yes.
how do you deviate from the main project?
So the deviation, because we've done this a number of different times, and we've gotten it to the point where we understand what we need to do at a pretty good level. We don't have to deviate as much as we did initially. But what we were able to do is the KPACs just get updated and adapted on the fly. So we actually did add this testing block was added last week. So as we're going through the process and we come up with something that needs to be in it that isn't in it, we can add it to the knowledge packet and push that to the assessment control. So that's how we kind of use the KPACs to address flexibility concerns. And if there are steps that we don't need to go through, we can right click and say that they're complete. And then we have a lot of the functionality that's in the assessment control as well. So we can add discussion topics and say why we skipped that step or something like that. Does that answer the question? Okay.
Josh, you're not going over the software release, right?
No. Well, I get, what,
Because that one has a lot of conditional loops that actually turn off based on conditions.
yeah, we are going to do that. We'll do that a little bit later. Okay, so Jeremy, if you can go back to the PowerPoint for me. We'll run through some of the other uses that we have for the software and then some of the things that we want to do moving forward. So one of the things is ongoing customer support. So we have a really good process for how we want to implement the software initially at a customer site. But then after that software is initially implemented, we want to make sure that our application engineers are engaged at a certain level and we have certain things that are being done as we go throughout the process. So very similar to what Matt showed us that won him the trophy that's sitting in front of him right now. We have a dashboard where all these activities that we want our application engineers to take part in as they're supporting customers on an ongoing basis are captured here. So once we come across something that we want everyone to do, if it's not in this particular process, we'll add it to the process. But this is kind of the main central place that people will go to when they're supporting a customer, and there's different events throughout the year. These flags that you see are the customer health evaluations. So every quarter, we're evaluating each customer and where they are from a health characteristic standpoint, which is what Jeff showed us a little bit earlier. In addition to that, Jeff was just talking about our software deployments. So when we do release a new version of the software, we have a process that we go through to actually get it to customers and get it put into production at their sites. based on a number of different components that could happen to the customers. Some of our customers host on Amazon Web Services. Some of our customers host internally. There's other things that are within this particular flow. Based on those decisions, you'll see these little diamond points that tell us to either go up or go down or go right or go left. And as the application engineer is walking through this process, they're answering questions, and the method is going to help them to go through the process correctly based on the characteristics of their customer. In addition to all these different processes that we have internally, we actually started using Auros to run our hiring process as well. So there are different things that we want to know during the phone interview. There are different things that we want to know as we're sending email questionnaires and we're screening resumes. So we have that all designed in Auros. When someone gets to a certain point in our hiring process, their information is put into an Auros assessment, and then we're able to track and manage all the questions that they've been asked, how they responded to those questions. If we have downloads of their resume, we can attach them to the assessment control. But that way, our greener level employees can run the beginning parts of that process, and then when we get to an in-person interview or on-site interviews, that's when the more senior level people can come in, they can get involved, and everything that's happened throughout that hiring process is captured and managed right here. So it's really helped us a lot, both to refine the process that we go through. Our interviews are much more consistent now, and the process has been yielding better results for us. In addition to that, once we do hire someone, we started running our new application engineers through a training process in the system as well. So we have different exercises and different information on the light green steps. So the light green steps would be like academic information. So they'll go through textbook style information. And then once they read that information, there's exercises that go along with it. So we found that when I first came on board, it took us about 6 months to get an application engineer from the point where you got hired to where we were really contributing on a project. We've been able to reduce that from 6 months to about 3 or 4 weeks. So we have some people that yesterday helped guide some of our interactive exercises, and they've only been on the staff for 3 or 4 months. So we're really able to expedite that process, and it doesn't take a lot of job shadowing anymore. Obviously, there's some things you can only get through job shadowing, but we're able to get people up to a level where they can contribute a lot sooner than we were able to do it before. So we hire someone, we train them, and now we're actually doing performance reviews in Auros as well. So we have certain criteria that we want to review our employees on. We have a certain cadence that we want to review them on as well. So that's all managed in Auros. So when someone gets hired, they have their review assessment control created, and then we know when they're supposed to be reviewed throughout a cadence. And at each point in time, as they progress through their employment, those reviews change, the content will change, and we'll be reviewing them on different things. So we manage that through Auros as well. And then we can go back historically and we can understand from an individual employee perspective how they rated on certain things, where the areas of improvement were, and it's all centrally located in one area. One of the things that I'll say about this is we had some concern with people being able to access other people's employee performance reviews, right? Because we don't want application engineers to be able to see other application engineers' performance reviews. So with the security in the communities of practice, the only people who can see everything are myself and Mr. Maffa, and everyone else only has access to their own reviews. And that's based on the roles that are assigned within the community of practice. And then our future applications, we've started initially to look at potentially doing our expense reports and our hour tracking sheets in Auros. And then in addition to that, we want to start training our application engineers, not just when they start, but as they progress through the different levels of application engineering. So we have a number of different things that we're looking at potentially doing here in the next year, where we think that as we continue to expand the footprint of the software, we'll be able to gain some of the same benefits that we are able to see now in our seed projects and in our software factory and those other processes as well. I think that's it. Are there any questions about any of that stuff? Mr. Verdanek.
I was just curious to know how you managed to do the segregation of the access in, just more of a technical question. How did you do it?
So very technical question. That is not a problem though. So what we do is we have one project that's in the community and it's locked down so that no one can see it. So no one's able to see that project, but then as soon as you're assigned as an evaluator on an assessment control, you can see that assessment control. So, for instance, if Evan has an employee review coming up, I'll create the assessment control for him, sorry about that, and then I'll assign it to him. That way he has access to it, but no one else can see it. So the only way you're granted access to anything in that community is through the evaluator role. The only person that can assign the evaluator role is one of us, and the only people who can see things that are not evaluators are the two of us as well. Yep. All right. 20 seconds over, but I think I'm good. Thank you guys, appreciate it. Power.
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm always continually impressed with how much work these guys are doing in the tool to help vet it out, to help make our company better, and we really take it to heart. So thank you for bearing with us while we show you how we use Auros to drive continuous improvement. Okay, we are on to a 15-minute break, and then we're going to come back and we'll get to hear from the Kohler Company and what they've been up to with Auros. So we'll see you back here in 15. Thank you.